Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Ramadan Mubarak. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Healthy Muslim in Ramadan. We're exploring how important it is for the individual to understand the fragility of his physical being and how to tend to his body and to his soul when he gets into trouble. We are not meant to be perfect. Allah makes us to fail in order that we should be humble and ask for help from Him. We've seen how much there is in the Quran, showing that the Quran itself is a healing. We've shown that the Prophet, peace be upon him, used prayers for others to heal them and use prayers for his own healing. However, it's very clear that in the Quran we are to ask for healing, and that healing comes from Allah. That is without a doubt. And during the time of the Prophet, experts, funny word to use at that time, but there were people, we'll go into details later, but there were people who were physicians. There was one woman who was a great friend of the Prophet, who he allowed her to teach his wives about her knowledge of herbal medicines. And later, in the early time of the Ummah, she became the person in charge of health and safety, if you like, in the marketplace. She was a great woman, a great scholar. And there was another person who was a physician who had traveled widely and brought knowledge of plants and other forms of treatment. And these treatments were welcomed by the Prophet and used. Prayer is not the only treatment, but all medicine works by the will of Allah. That was clearly understood. So the Islamic approach to medicine is an affirmation of Tawheed, which was formed in the core of its practitioners' spiritual beliefs. All of the early doctors in those times were people who were scholars of Islam. And it examined the entire system of man in his sickness within the context of his creational reality. In other words, what his genetics might have been, what his inheritance was, rather than, and other factors, circumstantial factors, rather than just concentrate on the principal malfunctioning organ or a most prominent symptom. So the original medicine at the time of the Prophet and in the early days of Islam was holistic medicine. Don't bother to read current treatises on holistic medicine. I urge you to go back to the original, because the profound philosophy that is contained there is something that should be current medical student reading. Islam was a pioneer in those days, and the wisdom of the medicine at that time has been lost. The role of doctors was emphasized in that they were known as hakim, a word derived from the word hukum, which means judgment. So the judgment of the doctor, with his independent knowledge of what may be good or not good for the patient, was something that was respected. Somebody asked the Prophet on one occasion, if everything is written and we are sick, why should we send for the doctor when the sickness is the decree of Allah? Very good question. You know, if Allah has sent us to our illness and the cure is in the hands of Allah, why bother with anyone else? The answer from the Prophet was, the doctor is part of the decree. And the doctors in those days knew that they were part of God's plan for that patient. They had the humility to know that sometimes Allah would use them in a way that enhanced their powers and ability to heal, and sometimes Allah would hide their abilities and the patient would remain with his sickness, because that ultimately was the wish of Allah. people who are conscious about this see this in everyday practice. Recently I had a woman who came from Nigeria. She is a lovely lady. She's a Christian. She's used to run a hospital, run the nursing services for a hospital, and she's retired. She's very fit. I'd seen her 3 years ago for some numbness in her legs, which was fairly inconsequential. But she had suddenly become weaker, and the numbness got worse. An MRI scan had been done in Nigeria, and they wanted her to come. The recommendation was for surgery. They wanted her to come to London. I said, look, if she's getting weak, you shouldn't bring her to London because the delay could harm her. No, they didn't want any surgery in Nigeria, only London would do. We were hard on Easter. And I said, please, come before Easter. We have to get this done before Easter, because Easter is a big problem in Western countries. It's a 5-day holiday, and hospitals close down, and even if they're working, you've got the B team on. So they arrived. They arrived flying in on Good Friday, arriving on the morning, very early morning of Easter Saturday. And they rang me at 8 o'clock in the morning and they said, she's much, much worse and she can barely stand. So I knew I had a sudden emergency on my hands. I had to find an expert neurosurgeon who would operate that day. Not easy on an Easter Saturday, and I was very grumpy. I did a lot of ringing around, found somebody in a hospital outside of London, very expert hospital, and I was pleasantly surprised to realise that the person who was on call at the weekend was somebody who actually was a very good surgeon, except his expertise was not the lower bit of the spine. Remember, in the West, you know, you have people specialising in the right little finger and another person specialising in the left little finger. And this surgeon was an expert in the mid part of the spine, not in the lower part of the spine. But then the operation on the lower part of the spine is a very easy one by comparison. So that was fine. I took her to the hospital. He hadn't had time to see her. He'd organised a scan. By this time I was too busy. I hadn't examined her. I watched her get out of her wheelchair and I realised, oh dear, this woman does not have a problem in the low part of the spine. She has a problem in the mid part of the spine. So I organised that a different scan was done, and indeed we saw exactly where the problem was. It was acute. It had to be operated on. I then realised that this woman was in the hands of a surgeon who is one of 2 people in England capable of doing the operation that was needed for her, that they'd just got a machine which cost £1 million, which would much more safely stabilise this portion of her spine than the previous techniques that would have been available. And he would be able to do the operation that afternoon. He had warned her about the possible consequence of the operation, that she might be paralysed. I said to her, look at what Allah has done for you. You could have been operated on in Nigeria. You would have had the wrong operation because they would have operated at the wrong bit. Everybody got a bumpy few discs and things like that in the lower part of the spine. That was not causing your paralysis. You have come to England against my advice, and you're being operated on by one of the 2 people skilled in this procedure with a new machine, which will be a benefit to you. I said, I'm not going to be seeing you anymore because the angels are looking after you. You're going to do fine. Unbelievably, she is now walking upstairs. Previously, she could barely walk 3 steps. That operation was at Easter. It's now a month, 5 weeks on. She's now walking upstairs, and I think she will make a full recovery, which is, as far as I'm concerned, a miracle. Now, some people might say, oh, well, that's the whole point of surgery. But I look at the circumstances. Allah intended her recovery. You must, you know, when we look at how circumstances move, you realize Allah, if He wants to cure you, He's going to find a way, even though you've tried to frustrate Him. And the same thing can happen in reverse, that you'll do all the right things, and in spite of that, something terrible will happen. We are in the hands of Allah, and the early surgeons and the early physicians knew that. And I'm sure that was a benefit to the patient. Please come back after the break. This is a fascinating subject. Welcome back. We're talking through what the early Muslims understood profoundly about the role of Allah in, as if you like, the chief physician who coordinates healing. The Prophet, peace be upon him, in spite of his status and standing as a person of awesome spirituality, he was humble enough to ask for the care of doctors. The Prophet said, "There is a remedy for every malady, and when the remedy is applied to the disease, it cures it with the permission of Allah." And he even recommended 2 remedies. These were his special favorites. Make use of the 2 remedies, honey and the Quran. And of course, honey was mentioned in the Quran. Sayyidina Ali had a very sophisticated understanding of what the body was and how its emotions governed what happened to it. And he described that the body has 6 states: health and malady, sleep and wakefulness, life and death. And he described the self as having conviction and doubt, vigilance and indifference, self-knowledge and ignorance. Profoundly, he understood how the personality of what he calls the self, I would call it personality perhaps, how this affected the person's effectiveness as a human being. He was a great, great leader. He got performances out of his men that were legendary. And he did this through understanding the style of management, a style of leadership, which deeply understood the people that he was leading. So, understanding our natures, our personalities, is a part of how we live our lives, and it's a part of how we make ourselves sick. We can live our lives in a way that is healthy and positive, or we can live our lives in a way that is self-destructive and leads to illness. How to do this, of course, general advice is found in the Quran, really importantly. And during Ramadan, anything that you feel yourself not quite to be performing at the beginning of Ramadan, I urge you to put it on a checklist as you address reading the Quran, and the answer will come to you. The ways in which you find yourself, you find the truth about yourself quietly, sensitively, from the words that leap off the page. It's better than any psychotherapist. And the early Muslim physicians were all alim. They were all people with deep religious understanding, and they understood this. In later times, I'll show you how they used the Quran as the healing. But how physicians were trained in those days, and how they were trained to look at what the patient was and how their understanding of the patient was, is so profound, and is what we are now trying to rediscover of holistic therapy. And in the book of Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, Medicine of the Prophet, a very ancient text written in the year 800, he lists 20 characteristics of a doctor. Well, I've been a doctor for 54 years. Nobody ever told me this. Not in 54 years of scientific training have I been told, really, some of the wisdoms that are in this list. It should be required medical student reading. First of all, okay, you diagnose the illness and identify its character. Okay, I can do that. I'm scientifically trained and I've had a lot of training on that, so tick that box. Consideration of its cause. Where did it strike first and what's the effective cause? Yeah, I might think about that. Not always, though. You think of things like cancer. How many oncologists stop to think, why has this patient got cancer at this time in their life? They just say, you've got cancer. Okay, thank you for the diagnosis, you're going to treat it. But if you don't get the setting of what caused my cancer, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to think it's more likely to come back. And there's a very complex interaction of hormonal factors, of psychological factors which influence the body in stress, in the immune system and so on, which come into this equation. There's an oncologist in New York, very famous guy, extremely good oncologist. And he recommends for his patients that they go out, that they laugh, that they stay with healthy people. Because he says, until you identify yourself with a healthy person, you'll never gain good health. You'll sink into the new environment of illness, which you welcome as a friend instead of seeing it as an enemy. I think he's very clever, and I've actually never seen any other oncologist do that. Then the physician will look at the strength of the patient, his physical resistance, his weak points. Is he able to withstand and overcome the illness? If so, would his body be able to deal with the illness or its treatment? So before even starting to treatment, they thought very deeply about who is this person? You know, where does he come from? Is he a tough Irish labourer who we can chuck the book at because he'll survive anything? Or is it a rather fragile person we have to be careful of? In our new government-run health systems, you never see the same patient twice. Your time with the patient is 10 minutes. How can you know these things? You haven't got time to see them. The patient is a stranger to you. You're only dealing with the superficial detail of the profound infrastructure of what that person is, what the strength of that person is, and whether you should treat them at all. Or if you do treat them very carefully. I have patients who say to me, please give me a half dose. Whenever doctors give me a strong dose, I have terrible side effects. They know themselves, they're right. I have other patients, they're so tough, I have to give them double doses. Where is that in modern science? Nowhere. But the person like me who's been around for a while, we learn these things. These things were known by the early Muslim physicians. What is the natural temperament of the body? I don't even know what that means. That's the level of my ignorance. But that's what the physicians then studied hard to know. And how is their normal temperament different? We get clues of this, where you get a family member who give you some questions, will answer you some questions about a patient's background. But most family members are intimidated to even dare to offer a suggestion to anybody in a healthcare system these days, when everything is done on a computer. The questions are asked, and the answer is yes or no. You're not allowed to expand on it. So you shut up after a bit. And this wisdom is being lost, but it profoundly influences genetics, it influences the immune system, it influences stress management, and all of that contributes to healing. What does this person do in his daily life? I don't ask those questions. That is an essential criteria for a good Muslim physician at the time of the Prophet and afterwards. I don't ask what he does with every day. I had an interesting man once. I had time. It was in the old days. And he came in with a very profound weakness. It was his nerves were failing, the nerves to his arms and legs. So he had numbness and he had weakness. And week after week it was getting worse. And he came into hospital for us to evaluate him. It had got to a point that he could barely walk, and he was profoundly disabled, and it was progressive, and we had no idea what caused it. And I had time on my hands, and he was a nice guy. He's really sweet, retired, sweet person, humble, gentle. And because I was young, I didn't know enough to know what clever disease this might have been. And I just wondered if he might have been in some way poisoned by something. So I had time to waste, and I said to him, let's go through your day. You get up in the morning, what do you do? And he said, I'll go to the bathroom and I'll brush my teeth. And I said, right, what do you brush your teeth with? And so on, we went through the day. And how he ate, and how he did this, and how he did that. And I said, what hobbies do you have? Oh, I like bowls. I don't know if you know, but there's a game which retired people love. Actually, it's an Olympic game as well, where you have big heavy balls and you have a light ball. And the small ball is thrown a long way away, and one team throws one of their big balls and the other one tries to knock it out of the way, and the one who gets nearest to the little ball has won. That's called bowls. In France it's called boule. And you see, it's a very popular sport because you don't need any special equipment. You can carry your boule set, and you see people happily playing this in marketplaces. So in England it's played on a lawn, and he belonged to his local bowls club. So I said, fine, take me through. What do? You go to the bowls club. Do you have tea? Yes. What does the tea taste like? Are you always having the same tea? Have you changed your tea? What about food? Have you changed the food? No, you hadn't changed the food. Then it got to playing bowls. I said, show me how you throw a ball. He said, well, I do. And he put his finger in his mouth. I said, why do you do that? He said, well, it increases the grip I have on the ball. I said, what's the taste when you put your finger in your mouth? He said, funny you ask that. He said, it tastes like metal. I went to the bowls club. I spoke to the guy in charge of the lawn. I asked him what fertilizer he put on the lawn. It contained a poison. We went back, checked him for the poison. He had the poison in his blood. We got rid of the poison. His nerves recovered. If I didn't know he licked his fingers when he threw his ball, I'd never have known what was wrong with him. Here it is in the book on Islamic medicine as the essential requirement of any physician to know this. Now, I've only got to number 6. On a criteria of 20, you see how profound the wisdom was in Islamic medicine. Go back to the old books to find out. Please come back. This is a fascinating journey. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.